It was a cold November day in Chicago, and thousands of desperate men and women had lined up in the streets. They stood in front of a storefront with a sign that read, quote, "Free soup, coffee, and donuts for the unemployed." This wasn't an unusual sight in the city during the Depression, as men with empty stomachs often turned to charity to get a hot meal. But the particular storefront and soup kitchen was an oddity. For one thing, it wasn't associated with any of the usual relief agencies in the city. Then, there was the behavior of the attendants handing out food, smiling women in white aprons who were friendly but stern. When some of the hungry beggars asked who was behind the soup kitchen, they received a strange reply. The attendants said that they had been specifically instructed to just hand out food. They weren't supposed to ask or answer any questions. For the next week, the suspicious kitchen continued to keep its doors open to all. Every day, the workers inside fed thousands of hungry people. They served up coffee and sweet rolls for breakfast, soup and bread for lunch, and soup, coffee, and bread for dinner. A week after the new soup kitchen opened its door, Chicago Evening Post broke the real story behind all the charity. The provider of all this generosity was not an average rich citizen just seeking a way to help the dispossessed. The newspaper revealed the truth. The whole soup kitchen was being run out of the pocket of the most wanted man in Chicago, the gangster Al Capone. The notorious criminal nicknamed Scarface didn't stop the handouts after his role in the soup kitchen was revealed to the public. The doors stayed open and people continued to be fed without questions. And the public who came through Capone's doors seemed to have no qualms about taking a free meal paid for by the gangster. As one newspaper put it, quote, "A hungry man is just as glad to get soup and coffee from Al Capone as from anyone else." On the surface, Al Capone's actions with the soup kitchen fit right in with one of the myths of the Western world, the story of Robin Hood. And this story of the man from humble beginnings who rises up by stealing from the wealthy and powerful, only to use his gains to help the downtrodden in his community, is a classic tale that has inspired many noble thieves stretching back all the way to the Middle Ages. But if Al Capone aimed to be Chicago's version of Robin Hood, there was only one small problem. In the story of Robin Hood, the thief and his merrymen never massacred 7 of their most bitter rivals in a bloody execution inside a garage. Al Capone was neither just a noble Robin Hood figure or a ruthless murderer. He was something different, a man who combined public generosity, cunning political manipulation, and brutal violence in a combination that allowed him to gradually take almost total control of one of America's most important cities. In this episode, we're going to focus on Al Capone's rise to power during a period of intense gang violence in the 1920s, known as the Chicago Beer Wars. Capone displayed some of his most ruthless tendencies during this time in order to win the war, and it all culminated in the infamous Valentines Day Massacre. And then through this story, we'll try to understand a bit about the contradictions inside Capone's life, and how one man could be capable of such radical acts of both murder and mercy. Scarface and the Fox. In January of 1925, Chicago's South Side gang leader Johnny Torrio was heading home from a shopping trip with his wife when he was ambushed. As his arms were full of bags and packages, the sedan pulled up alongside Torrio's car and 2 men jumped out. The assassins shot his driver and then turned on the gang leader. One of the killers shot Torrio multiple times in his arm and chest before the pair drove off and left him for dead. Amazingly, though, Torrio survived his wounds. While the gang leader recovered in the hospital, a committee for the city government was called to investigate the shooting. The officers looking into the shooting got nothing out of Torrio, as he stuck to the famed code of silence, even though he knew exactly who had shot him. And so, the investigation turned to interviewing other men in Torrio's circle who might be able to shed light on the shooting. The committee spoke to one particularly interesting young man during their investigation. He was a 25-year-old Italian man who identified himself as a furniture salesman. This young man's testimony was taken and his name was written down as Alphonse Capone. Capone was spelled with an I on the end instead of an E, and for now, This young Italian gangster wasn't significant enough for the cops to even spell his name correctly. But in only a few years' time, almost all of the police in the city would be under his control. But in order to reach the heights of power that he would eventually achieve, Al Capone had to win a gang war that would turn out to be more brutal than any other in America during Prohibition. So in order to understand Al Capone and his rise to power, you have to start with the man who was most responsible for turning him into the man he eventually became. That man was the same one who nearly died that day on the Chicago streets, John Torrio. Capone's control of Chicago would never have been possible if it weren't for the ways Torrio had already reshaped the city's crime years before his assassination attempt. Torrio was a nephew of one of America's most important mafia bosses, James Big Jim Calissimo, who had almost single-handedly created the Southside Gang that would become known as the Chicago Outfit. Before Calissimo came along, Chicago crime was centered around three specific areas: labor racketeering, gambling, and prostitution. But even though these activities thrived throughout the city, there was very little coordination between groups of criminals. Before Big Jim, most of the criminal groups in the city stuck to only one of those vices. Calissimo revolutionized Chicago's mob structure by creating a larger organization that was diversified into all three major criminal activities at once. Calissimo grew his empire from a few small brothels in the vice-laden Levee district of the city to an organization that was large enough to draw the attention of the infamous Chicago Black Hand organization, a powerful group in the city whose business was blackmail and extortion. When the Black Hand tried to extort Calissimo into shutting down his operation, he called on Johnny Torrio to move from New York to Chicago, try to settle the growing dispute. Torrio was famous in the criminal world for his talent as a mediator. He was known to be incredibly smart and pragmatic, never letting violence get in the way of business. Over the next few months after he arrived in Chicago, Torrio successfully navigated Calissimo's gang out of the corner that they had been stuck in through a few well-placed bribes and assassinations. He also successfully managed to increase Big Jim Calissimo's power while avoiding outright war with any of his rival criminal groups. Calissimo rewarded this success by putting Torrio in charge of all of his Chicago operations, and Torrio helped the gang grow even larger. One of the major changes Torrio made as he took more and more control of the gang was to move the group's main headquarters of operations out of the city and into the nearby suburb of Cicero. Torrio then worked to control political elections in Cicero and other nearby suburbs until he had complete control over the elected officials in the area. Then he gradually took control of the town's gambling operations. This included opening a club where Torrio brought in his loyal protege from New York to work as a bouncer, a young man named Al Capone. Interestingly, the timing of Capone's move from New York to Chicago might have saved the young gangster's life. Initially, after Torrio had gone to Chicago, Capone had stayed in New York and worked as an enforcer for Torrio's business in the city, handing out beatings to anyone who owed the gangster money. But one day, Capone beat up the wrong man when he attacked an Irish gang member named Arthur Finnegan, who had made a rude joke about Irish girls who married Italians. Capone was Italian with an Irish wife, so this joke struck a nerve and he almost beat Finnegan to death. Now, this incident would have almost certainly ended with retaliation from the Irish gang against Capone, so instead he was sent to join Torrio in Chicago and his life was spared. When Capone arrived in Chicago, he stepped into a city that was a powder keg of rival gangs, ready to explode into all-out warfare. But Johnny Torrio had worked hard to avoid Chicago ending up this way. As we said earlier, Torrio was actually known in the underground world for being a master mediator, and he understood the bloody cost that a gang war could bring. One of the main initiatives Torrio tried to do once he took charge of Calissimo's outfit was to prevent any future fighting over territory between gangs. At the dawn of Prohibition, there were 9 major gangs all jostling for control of the Chicago alcohol market. But there was one primary group in particular where Torrio saw the potential for tension, and that was with a group known as the North Side Gang, which was led by a man named Dean O'Banion. So he came up with a plan to try and avoid violence between the groups. Torrio was able to successfully forge together an agreement between most of Chicago's bootlegging gangs to set up a citywide cartel. Each of the major groups was given a very specific territory in which they could operate as a monopoly without interference from other gangs. For the first few years of Prohibition, this cartel worked wonderfully and everyone profited. But eventually, greed and rivalries between the different groups began to put tension on the carefully designed peace. The dawn of Prohibition not only brought tension from the outside, but also from within Calissimo's gang. A falling out between Calissimo and Torrio came when Calissimo resisted expanding their business further into bootlegging. Torrio decided that Big Jim had lost a step, and so he orchestrated the murder of the gang leader. May of 1920, Big Jim Calissimo was killed in broad daylight outside of his restaurant. And with Calissimo's death, it gave Torrio control of the organization that he would eventually pass down to Al Capone only a few years later. Torrio now headed the biggest gang in the city, with Capone as his right-hand man. He wasted no time moving the gang's main operations almost entirely into bootlegging, and an empire was born that would rule Chicago for years to come. But keeping the gang on top of Chicago's liquor business turned out to be a dangerous task, as greed over the immense profits possible in alcohol brought about the very gang war that Torrio had worked to avoid. The Beer Wars. Torrio's cartel agreement lasted for almost 4 years before it fell apart into all-out gang warfare. Cracks in the cartel started to show in 1923 when a few smaller gangs tried to expand their influence by selling booze outside of their designated territories. This activity exposed the main failure of Torrio's system, which was a problem of enforcement. Because there was no legal grounds for the agreements between the groups, when someone broke the lines of territory, the problem couldn't be solved peacefully through the courts of the law. Instead, the only method of punishment was through inter-cartel violence. Since Johnny Torrio was the unofficial arbiter of the cartel, a gang leader could approach him if he felt that he had been wronged by another gang. Torrio had the power to decide if the breach was great enough to warrant punishment. If it was, he would put together an inter-gang group of enforcers to punish the infringing member of the agreement. This is exactly what happened in early 1924 when the Italian Jenna crime family began selling their alcohol across territorial lines, violation of the Northside Gang's sovereignty. The leader of the Northside Gang, an Irishman named Dean O'Banion, petitioned Torrio to punish the Jennas. Torrio decided that this particular violation of the agreement was not egregious enough to need a response, and refused to punish the Jennas, which infuriated O'Banion. O'Banion knew that Torrio was not enforcing the agreement evenly. The Jenna family was Italian and a natural ally of Torrio's gang. Meanwhile, the Irish Northside Gang had always been a rival of the Southside Gang, and Torrio had a natural incentive to want them weakened. Ultimately, though, the biggest factor in the break between the Northside Gang and the rest of the cartel was simple hatred between two powerful leaders, Torrio and O'Banion. 2 years later, in the heart of the violence that followed, Capone talked about how it all started and said that, quote, "It was never over business. It was all a bad feeling between one man and another." Whatever the cause, O'Banion made the decision to ignore Torrio's ruling and take retaliation into his own hands. He hijacked a Jenna booze shipment as punishment against the group that had broken in on his territory. And he didn't stop there. That May, he set Torrio up by selling him a brewery that he knew was about to be raided by police. And Johnny Torrio lost $500,000 in the raid, and was sentenced to a mandatory prison term of 2 years for bootlegging. But despite this direct attack by O'Banion, Torrio still hoped he could keep the peace. For most of 1924, he did not retaliate against O'Banion, and he tried to work with an intermediary named Mike Merlo, who was high up within the larger Sicilian organized crime syndicate, in order to prevent further escalation. But in October, O'Banion and his men returned from a trip to Colorado, armed to the teeth with machine guns and other weapons. It was clear the North Side Gang was preparing for war. But Torrio never gave O'Banion the chance to use his new arsenal. In early November, 3 men sent by Torrio and the Jennas killed the Northside leader in a combined attack outside a flower shop that served as the Northside Gang's headquarters. Outright war between the Northsiders and Torrio and Capone's Southsiders was now unavoidable, and this brings us back to the assassination attempt by the Southside Gang on Johnny Torrio in January of 1925. Before we get into the fallout from the attack and the rest of the war between the North and South gangs, it's important to know a little bit about the figures that stepped into leadership, the Northside Gang following O'Banion's death. The man who took his place was a Polish-American gangster named Jaime Weiss. At any other point in time, Weiss might have been the perfect man to work with Torrio in stopping the exchange of violence between the two gangs. Weiss wasn't just another thug. Instead, he was known for being incredibly strategic and intelligent. In one entertaining story, Weiss and another gangster had been the subject of a raid by the U.S. Marshals, who confiscated a load of guns and weapons. Weiss responded by actually filing a lawsuit against the Marshals, claiming they had taken a load of silk shirts, socks in the raid. The lawsuit caused the case to get so tied up in the courts that charges related to the raid were eventually dropped altogether. But by the time Weiss ascended to control of the Northside Gang, his pragmatic personality had changed because of a little-known secret. He was already dying. For years, he had suffered from severe headaches and fainting spells. In the years since his death, it has been determined that he had a rare type of arterial cancer, along with what was probably a significant brain tumor. Although Weiss wouldn't have known this exact diagnosis at the time, he had a clear idea that something was wrong and that he didn't have long to live. And the problem for Torrio, Capone, and the Southside Gang was that this death sentence made Weiss a loose cannon. He was completely unafraid to die. The only thing he cared about doing with the time he had left alive was getting revenge for O'Banion's murder. Now, the other important figure to know who ascended to power with O'Banion's death was the man who would become most remembered as a rival of Al Capone. This is Bugs Moran. He had been a childhood friend of O'Banion's and shared power with Weiss following the leader's death. Moran had a very specific hatred for Capone in particular that would intensify the war between the two sides. It was Weiss and Moran together who personally executed the hit on Torrio outside his home that we opened the episode with. Moran had actually stood over the already injured Torrio and prepared to fire the final shots into the gang leader's head, only to have the gun jam. And this saved Johnny Torrio's life. It took him a month in the hospital to recover from his many gunshot wounds. During that time, Capone spent each night sleeping in his mentor's room, facing the door with a gun in his hand. The hospital staff in charge of treating Torrio were so afraid of Capone that they didn't even try to ask him to leave his weapons outside the room. Torrio eventually recovered from his injuries, but the attack made him realize that his time as leader of the Southside Gang had come to an end. He served the prison sentence he still owed for the bootlegging conviction that O'Banion had set up for him earlier in the year. And after his release, Torrio left Chicago for good. He moved to New York and then back to Italy with his wife and mother. During his time in power, Torrio had grown the Southside Gang's business to an incredible profit of $70 million a year. This is about $1.2 billion in today's money. Now that Torrio had given up power, it would be up to Capone to lead the organization, fight the war against the Northside Gang, and grow the multi-million-dollar business of bootlegging to new heights, all at the age of 26. Trading body bags. After taking over leadership of the Southside Gang, Al Capone's first priority was winning the war that had exploded across the streets of Chicago. No other city in all of America during Prohibition faced the outright gang warfare that Chicago did over the next 4 years. All of the city's major gangs chose sides in the conflict. On one side was the Capone-led Southsiders, the Jennas, and a third group called the Sheldon Stanton Gang. Aligned against them was Weiss and Moran's Northsiders, along with their allies, which included groups such as the West Side O'Donnells, the GWK, and the Saltis McErlin gang. The war resulted in dozens of killings each year and a cycle of murder and retaliations on both sides. The violence of this period is staggering. Between 1921 and 1924, there were an estimated 349 murders in Chicago. And in 1925 alone, there was an average of more than a murder a day for the whole year. We won't go through every detail of the ensuing violence, but a few important moments of escalation took place between the assassination attempt on John Torrio in early 1925 and the bloody event that ended the war in 1929 that became known as the Valentines Day Massacre. First, Capone would have never been around to orchestrate the famous hit if he hadn't miraculously survived Weiss's most daring attempt on his life, September of 1926. Capone and his associates were having lunch at the Hawthorne Inn in Cicero, the heart of Southside territory, when 10 cars drove by and showered the building with machine gun fire. Incredibly, though more than 1,000 bullets were fired, neither Capone or his bodyguard were hit. The only man injured in the shooting was a gangster named Paul Ricca, who had seen the machine guns in the car and risked his own life by running into the restaurant to warn Capone only moments before the gunfire started. Capone was so grateful to Ricca for saving his life that he brought him into his inner circle of the organization. He even eventually served as the best man at Ricca's wedding, which is the only time Capone did such a thing for one of his men. The crew that orchestrated the hit included both Weiss and Moran, along with a few of their associates. Legend has it that when Capone was asked if he knew who was responsible for the attempt, he replied, quote, "Watch the morgue, they'll show up there." Capone didn't take long to fulfill this promise and get his revenge. But unlike the Northside gang's attack, which had been a wild hail of bullets, he moved with precision against his enemies. He had a pair of his most trusted men set up a machine gun nest in an apartment building outside of the Northside headquarters. The assassins included Jack Machine Gun McGurn, who would become one of Capone's favorite hitmen, the eventual architect of the Valentine's Day Massacre. And about a month after the hit on Capone, Jaime Weiss and a few of his men were crossing the street from the nearby Holy Name Cathedral and returning to their base when Capone's men opened fire and killed Weiss. The death of Jaime Weiss was a shock to the Northside gang. Not only had their leader been killed once again by Capone and his men, it had happened in the very heart of their territory. Al Capone's ruthlessness and cunning had been shown in full force, and it made the Northsiders consider bringing an end to the cycle of violence. Near the end of 1926, the Northside and Southside leaders met in a Chicago hotel and negotiated a ceasefire in the war. They agreed for there to be no more killing and that all the attacks in the past would be considered as closed incidents that didn't call for retaliation. They also tried to fix the flaws in Torrio's original peace plan by naming delegates inside each party who were responsible for disciplining their own gang members if anyone stepped outside the terms of the agreement. Now, it makes sense why the Northside gang would seek peace at this time, as they were clearly losing the war with Capone in charge. But what is more interesting is what is said about Capone himself, that he would agree to a ceasefire right when the tide was turning in his favor. Ultimately, Capone recognized how bad the violence was for all of their businesses. Another legendary quote has it that one of the first things he said at the peace meeting was, quote, "We're all making a shooting gallery of a great business." The peace between the North and South Side gangs held for almost a full year. But by the end of 1927, it was apparent that violence was once again right around the corner. Just like how the gang had started because of the hatred shared between Johnny Torrio and Dean O'Banion, it was personal animosity that brought back the war for Chicago's streets. Bugs Moran and Al Capone simply hated each other, and this led Moran to become convinced that his organization was being cut out of lucrative gambling deals that Capone had drawn up for the gangs in the city. Once killing resumed between the two groups, Capone was already pushed nearly to his limit, and then a few final escalations took place in early 1929, which brought Al Capone past his breaking point. First was the murder of two heads of the Chicago chapter of the Sicilian Mafia and a close ally of Capone, Pasqualino Patsy Lolordo, and Antonio the Scourge Lombardo. Lolordo was killed in his home by an unidentified gunman working for Moran, and Lombardo was killed alongside his bodyguard in the streets of Chicago. The hits were part of an effort to strip Capone of his mafia protection, and Capone knew the loss of his mob allies left him vulnerable. Finally, when Capone learned that Moran had placed a $50,000 bounty on his head, decided it was time to end the war once and for all. St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The task of planning an ambush to eliminate Moran and his colleagues fell primarily into the hands of Jack Machine Gun McGurn, Capone's favorite hitman. Over the course of his time associated with Al Capone, it's suspected McGurn performed over 22 hits for the Southside Gang, including some of the most bold and notorious public killings. McGurn had even survived multiple attempts on his own life by Moran's gang in retaliation for his killings, including being shot in the chest. His skill, combined with his desire for revenge on Moran, made McGurn the perfect tool for Capone's final act against the Northside Gang. The location where the hit would take place was obvious from the start. Moran ran much of his illegal bootlegging business out of a warehouse and garage on North Clark Street. McGurn would simply need a bait tempting enough to guarantee Moran and his men would be at the garage on the morning of Valentine's Day. Perfect bait was created in a hijacked truckload of Capone's own Canadian whiskey, which was offered for sale to Moran's gang. With the bait in place, Capone's men rented an apartment across from the trucking warehouse and garage and waited to spring their trap. Capone himself made sure to be out of the state on the day of the hit. He was relaxing at his home down in Florida, which gave him legal deniability of the whole affair. On the morning of Thursday, February 14, 1929, Capone's lookouts reported a group of Moran gang members walking into the front door of the garage. They even claimed to have spotted Moran himself among the group, though this identification would later prove to be mistaken. Convinced the moment was at hand, the spotters called a payphone in a nearby garage where Capone's team of killers were waiting. Two men, dressed in stolen uniforms of Chicago police officers, drove over to Clark Street in an automobile fitted to look like a Chicago police car. A second vehicle, also disguised as a police car and carrying a pair of fake police detectives dressed in overcoats, was close behind. Finally, heading towards Clark Street from a different direction was a decoy delivery truck. The delivery truck arrived last, pulling into the alley where the garage door was located. The truck blew its horn, and two of Moran's men opened the double garage doors to let the truck in. As soon as Moran's men opened the garage, they were met by two uniformed officers who had entered through the front door of the warehouse. The fake officers, who carried shotguns and announced themselves as Chicago police, ordered the 7 men inside to line up against the brick wall on the side of the garage. Because of the widespread corruption within the Chicago Police Department, Moran's men were probably not worried by the unsuspected presence of officers. They did not expect to actually be arrested, only to be shaken down for an extra bribe in order to let the delivery proceed. In the moments before the shooting began, it is unlikely any of the 7 men considered the possibility that they had stepped into an ambush. As the 7 men faced the brick wall, one of the uniformed officers whistled, signaling the additional 2 hitmen dressed as detectives to enter through the garage. The detectives were dressed in long overcoats and were concealing Thompson machine guns beneath their outfits. Once the detectives were a few feet from the wall, they pulled out the Tommy guns and opened fire on the 7 unsuspecting men. The results were efficient and brutal, with machine gun fire sweeping over the men 3 times. The gunfire didn't stop until all 7 men were slumped on the ground in a pool of blood and brass shell casings. And then, for the benefit of local witnesses, the fake uniformed officers pointed their shotguns at the machine gunners and walked them out to Clark Street, make it look like they were being arrested. With their hands raised in the air, the gunmen were loaded into a dark Cadillac, which sped off and disappeared. In total, the whole bloody event is estimated to have taken less than 5 minutes. By the time the actual police arrived at the scene of the massacre, only one man was left alive, Frank Gusenberg, who, along with his brother Pete, was one of Moran's best hitmen. He was riddled with 22 bullets, but somehow still breathing as the first officer approached the scene. Upon finding the man alive, the policeman asked him who was responsible for shooting him. Gusenberg held to the code of silence that governed mob violence, insisting that, quote, "Nobody shot me." He would die in a hospital 3 hours later, defiant until his last breath. The hit had gone almost perfectly, except for one small but important detail. By the time news of the mob hit had spread around Chicago and was catching the biggest headlines in every local, national, and international newspaper, it was apparent that Bugs Moran was not among the 7 bodies laying at the garage. Moran had survived the massacre by pure luck and chance. He arrived at the scene late by a matter of minutes. Upon reaching the garage, he had seen the police car parked outside and fled the scene, thinking his garage was the subject of a police raid. Only because of this did he manage to avoid being killed by Capone's men. However, even without eliminating Moran, the massacre had achieved its primary aim, wiping out the muscle of the Northside gang and effectively ending the long war. Moran would survive, but his days as one of Chicago's top gangsters died in the garage that day with his men. Fast forwarding a few years later, Moran would eventually get his revenge on McGurn. The hitman avoided charges for the Valentines Day massacre, but was eventually gunned down in a bowling alley February 14, 1936, the 7th anniversary of the massacre. It's widely suspected Moran was responsible for the hit. As for Capone, the St. Valentine's Day massacre cleared the way for an almost monopolistic rule over the Chicago underground, but it also turned out to be the start of its eventual downfall. The publicity that came with the massacre made Capone far and away the most notorious gangster in the country. Pressure mounted from that day forward for federal authorities to find a way to take him down. The man of the people. If the Valentine's Day massacre shows the height of Capone's power as a ruthless killer, it does not really capture the many dimensions of the man. Many gangsters in Chicago and other places had showed a willingness to use the type of fear and violence that Capone had employed in the event. But almost no one reached the heights of power that he did in Chicago. I think the reason for this is that Al Capone realized violence was not always the most effective option for gaining control of a population. In the years following the Valentine's Day massacre, Capone knew that one of his best weapons to deal with the mounting pressure from authorities was not a Tommy gun, but instead the public's goodwill and support. After the Depression hit, he found the perfect opportunity to clean up his public image. The soup kitchen he ran that we mentioned in the opening served over 2,000 meals a day to the hungry citizens of Chicago. After it was revealed that he ran the establishment, Capone began showing up at the soup kitchen personally to connect with the struggling people of his city. He'd walk the line of poor men waiting for a meal and shake hands or share a word of encouragement with each of them. The work of Capone's soup kitchen culminated in a 1930 Thanksgiving meal where its estimated 5,000 people were served a meal of beef stew. This sounds like an odd choice for a Thanksgiving dinner. The reason behind it is pretty interesting. The kitchen had actually planned to serve turkey and cranberry sauce until word spread that there had been a heist of 1,000 turkeys in the city. Capone wasn't connected to the stolen turkeys, but he worried the public might assume he had been responsible, so he changed the menu to beef stew to prevent any rumors from spreading. The line on that Thanksgiving wound all the way around the block and actually backed up right in front of the police station, which sent a clear message to the authorities tasked with bringing him down. The kitchen was such a success that city officials began to worry Capone might harness his huge amount of public support into a legitimate run in politics. One Illinois newspaper wrote, quote, "It would be rather terrifying to see Capone run for mayor of Chicago. We are afraid he would get a tremendous vote. It is even conceivable that he might be elected after a few more stunts like his soup kitchens." But even Al Capone's acts of charity couldn't be run completely legitimately. It was eventually revealed in his trial that most of the food served in the soup kitchen had actually been supplied by other restaurants and charities in the city that Capone and his men had shaken down for donations. He might not have spent a single dime for one of his most effective tactics to win over the city's residents. I think the combination of these stories, the violence of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, political savvy of the Thanksgiving meal, worked together to paint a picture of just why Capone became so powerful. He was a man of strategy, and whether that meant using brutal violence or cunning tactics, he was able to read a situation and determine just what needed to be done to increase his presence in the Chicago underground.